Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Spiritual Research Center here in Hamilton, Ontario. My name is Zachary Strong, and I am an engineering physics graduate, a scholar, an author, and a musician. And today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between biblical sin, Satan, and entropy. The very short story is that there is a relationship between the laws of physics and spiritual concepts like sin and Satan. And incredibly, we can point to an equation in physics where Satan is hiding. Satan is actually hiding in a key equation in thermodynamics, and I'm gonna show you kind of where that is and how this all works. Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about entropy and what entropy is. We're also going to be talking about Satan and who Satan is. We're going to be looking at how Satan has been related to entropy elsewhere in Jewish literature. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about something called the Gibbs Free Energy equation, which is a foundational equation in physics that involves entropy. And I'll be able to point to a certain place in that equation to show you where Satan is hiding. Okay, so we're going to be rooting Satan out from the laws of physics. And yeah, I think this will be interesting and fun. Okay, so let's just start with what entropy is. Unless you've studied physics at a university level, you might have heard of entropy, but you might not necessarily know exactly what it is, so we'll start there. Entropy is a scientific concept that measures the amount of disorder, randomness, or uncertainty within a system, and it's also a measure of energy unavailable for doing useful work. So on the screen, I've got a visual representation of what entropy is. On the left-hand side, we have a system with high entropy. Okay, all the little particles are scattered around. It's kind of random. There's not much order to it. Okay, so that's high entropy. And then on the right-hand side is a system with low entropy, where all of those particles are joined together into a single megaparticle. Okay, it's more ordered, there's less disorder, and therefore lower entropy. Now, to use a practical example, okay, imagine a new car, a brand new car, okay? That's low entropy. Okay, a brand new car is low entropy. Okay, everything is working the way that it should. It's brand new, it's shiny, all of that stuff. That's low entropy. But after a few years, as you're driving that car, you're going to run into some problems. Maybe there's an issue with your transmission. Maybe some parts are getting rusted. You've got to switch out the tires. Things start breaking down. Things start not working the way that they should. Okay? That's entropy. That's entropy. Okay? So a brand new car is low entropy, and then like a beat up, rusted hunk of metal is high entropy. Now, the second law of thermodynamics basically says that entropy is always increasing. The universe tends towards disorder. Okay, things break down, things become rusted, and so on. And in order to maintain order and coherence in a system, it requires energy, it requires work. Okay, if you want your house to stay clean, you have to put effort into maintaining the house. If you want your car to keep running, you've got to put effort into maintaining the car, and so on. Okay? Now, for those of you who are familiar with the biblical Satan, you can probably already see why Satan might be associated with entropy. Okay? Because Satan is the angel that tries to break things down. Satan is the angel that tries to create chaos, and so on, right? And both in Judaism and Christianity, this is true. But in Judaism, Satan is actually operating underneath God's will. Okay? Judaism refers to Satan as the Yetzer Hara, or evil inclination, which is the force within humans that tempts them to sin. Okay? And we see this in the first chapter of Job. Okay? Satan appears in the heavenly court. Satan basically says, hey, there's this guy named Job. I want to cause him trouble. And then God says, okay, but here's the limits to the trouble that you can cause him, right? And Satan stays within those limits. And so within the first chapter of Job, we can see that Satan's purpose is to create chaos, to create disorder, to create entropy, to break things down. But at the same time, Satan is not necessarily a rebellious angel. He's just playing a certain function within the universe and is operating underneath God's supervision and providence. Okay? And I think that might be a surprise to Christians that watch this video, because in Christianity, Satan is kind of this rebellious angel and so on. But we see in the first chapter of Job that this just isn't the case, right? Satan is operating with instructions and with limits, which means he's, fulfilling God's will. Now, within Jewish literature, Satan and entropy have been linked in a couple of ways, okay? Back in the 1800s, before entropy really became a widely known concept, there was a Jewish sage named the Malbim, and this is what he said in his commentary on the book of Job. The Satan's powers of destruction and disintegration are not found in heaven, but rather are eternally bonded to physical matter. The Satan's answer to God in Job chapter 1 implies that these powers occur as part of the natural ongoing process of disintegration inherent in all matter. And in Job chapter 1, Satan answers God and says, I was going to and fro on the earth and walking in it. Okay, and so what this is implying is that the Satan's powers of disintegration and chaos creating and so on are relegated and confined to the physical universe. Okay, Satan is not up in heaven destroying anything. He's destroying things here on earth. Okay, now what I think is really interesting is that this commentary on Job was written in the 1800s, and this was a time when the physicists were still figuring out the concept of entropy. Maybe it's the case that the Malbim had heard of entropy and was writing this based on his knowledge in physics, but the second law of thermodynamics was not widely known at this point. Physics was still developing these concepts, and so it's entirely possible that the Malbim had developed this relationship in isolation from physics. Okay, so in Jewish literature, all that to say, there's already some relationship between Satan and entropy. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a clip from a more recent lecture where Satan and entropy are linked explicitly. Okay? The rabbi that's giving this lecture knows about entropy, knows about the laws of physics, and he's made this connection himself. Okay, so watch this clip from Rabbi Mendel Kessin.
So there's certain things that changed. Once he became part of you, he's no longer outside of you trying to tempt you to sin. He's now giving you drives and urges to sin. All the drives and urges that you can imagine to defy God and to sin, to do what you want to do and so on, right? Without taking God into account that he's the source of your life and the direction and so on, right? He is now part of you. Now, first thing, what happens to the world? Well, the Yetzer Hara is fundamentally an entity that destroys, that decomposes living things, the forces, and also inorganic things. How does it manifest? Because what happened was that since the Yetzer Hara now invades your world, right, you decompose. Ultimately, that is what death is. Death is nothing more than the decomposition of living material. So now all things decompose. You see, the ability of physical matter to decompose is the manifestation of the Yetzer Hara in the physical world. But besides that, this world essentially is energy. And we know that energy dissipates. It's called entropy. That is also the Yetzer Hara. Where a system that has energy, it will dissipate. It will weaken automatically. In fact, that's the second law of thermodynamics. That's also the Yetzer Hara. It's interesting that the second law of thermodynamics is the Yetzer Hara, right? So before that, where a man would live forever, wasn't just a man, nothing would die. There's no such thing as death or any kind of deterioration or decomposition. And there's no entropy, you see. But once Adam ate from the tree, he introduced the Yetzer Hara, a new reality, where the Yetzer Hara now invades you through the force called the Zayama, you see, and therefore he now exercises his properties, which is Zayama, and that decomposes living matter and also destroys energy, you see, which is bad. You see, that's the manifestation of the Satan in our world. Very important idea. But there's something else that changed as a result of that. As long as the Satan was on the outside, you see, so he could not share anything that you were privy to at all. But once the Satan became part of you, you know, then all of a sudden things changed. Now what did change is before Adam ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, what was his job? Well, the reality was there was no Yetzer Hara in him. So his job was basically ignore the advice of the Satan, which Chava should have done. She should have ignored the advice, the satanic advice, to defy God by eating from that tree. That's all. But now that the Yetzer Hara has entered your physical body, the avodah, the service, is no longer to ignore the advice, right? Because he's part of you. What you have to do is expel the Satan, right? You got to get rid of him. In other words, you have to kill him. You see? You have to expel the Satan from the physical body. It's a different avodah. But the question is, wait a minute, what do you mean expel the Satan? How? You see, so what the Rebbeinu Shem did, you see how the avodah, the service, the task, changed because the reality changed. So the Rebbeinu Shem now has to change reality to accommodate that task. What do you do? So until Adam ate from the tree, when the Yetzer Hara was outside the physical universe, or whatever, wherever he was, right? And your job was to ignore him, right? Then each thing lives and continues to exist because God issues forth, and they're the spheres, a divine flow of spiritual energy that creates and maintains the existence of every iota, every molecule, atom, has to be sustained, created and sustained by God from nanosecond to nanosecond, from instant to instant. If God would cease to think about this, everything would instantly evaporate, instantly. You see, because in order to exist, they have to have a continuous flow of divine or spiritual energy, you see. But in order to fulfill the second job, which is the second reality, where you now must expel the Satan and destroy evil from within you, right? He has to change that reality. So what he did is he took the flow of energy, divine energy, that sustains the Satan, because even a Malach has to have that energy. And certainly man, all things have to have that energy. And he cut, sort of like the energy goes through a cable that goes directly into the Satan. So the Rebbeinu Shem came over to the Satan and cut the cable, which instantly means that the flow of energy stops to the Satan. So before the Sutton evaporates, whatever, he takes the edge of the cable of the Sutton and he connects it to man, you see. So it's incredible. Now all mankind, mankind has what? Has a cable that comes down through which the divine energy flows. One part goes into mankind, Adam. The other part goes into the Sutton.
Okay, so that is pretty interesting. However, as an engineering physics graduate, I'm forced to wonder, where can we find these concepts in the laws of physics? Where in the laws of physics does Satan operate? Okay, and the things that Rabbi Kessin was discussing in terms of choosing to support good and choosing to give energy to the Satan, okay, where in physics would we find this? And the answer is the Gibbs Free Energy equation. Okay, so if you haven't studied physics at a university level, you might not be aware of the Gibbs Free Energy equation. But basically, this is what it is. The change in available energy to do work is equal to the change in the total energy of the system minus the entropy. Okay, and so we use this equation to figure out if a reaction is going to be spontaneous or not. Okay, like, I don't want to get too far into the details, but if we rearrange the terms in this equation, we get total energy equals useful energy plus entropy. Okay, the total energy equals the useful energy plus the entropy. And this is exactly what Rabbi Kessin was talking about. Okay, because if you add energy into a system, if you're expending energy, you are either doing so in a useful way or in a way that increases entropy. Okay, and so when Rabbi Kessin is talking about, you can either do good or you can do evil. You can put energy into good things or you can give energy to the Satan. Okay, what he's talking about is the Gibbs Free Energy equation. Okay, because any energy that we spend on sin or whatever contributes to the overall level of entropy in the universe. It gives the Satan energy. It makes him stronger. Okay? And I think this is really interesting because even the laws of physics, even the Gibbs Free Energy equation testifies to the truth of the Torah and the truth of what Rabbi Kessin is saying here. Okay? Satan works through entropy. What he tries to do is to tempt people to sin, which increases the amount of disorder and chaos in the universe. Okay, so Satan is basically the force within the universe that is trying to disintegrate everything, trying to bring things towards chaos, right? The Satan might even be the reason that the second law of thermodynamics exists and functions in the way that it does. Okay, so yeah, that's basically all I had to share in this video, was the relationship between sin, Satan, and entropy. As I hope I've demonstrated to you, the Gibbs Free Energy equation is kind of the main thing that we should be looking at here. Okay, when you have energy, you can either be investing it in a useful way or in a way that it increases the amount of chaos and disorder, both in your own life and in the universe. Okay, and the Satan's role in all of this is to tempt us, okay? And that way, by tempting us, we're given a choice between good and evil. And it's God's will and God's hope that we choose good. Okay? So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. There's a lot more to be talking about when it comes to the relationship between physics and spirituality. And on my channel, if you aren't subscribed yet, give me a like, give me a subscribe, because I'll be talking a little bit more about physics and the Bible. And I'll be talking also about biblical truth and biblical proofs. Okay. I'm currently working on a video on the Exodus and Egyptology. And I've got a whole bunch of other stuff that I'm cooking up as well. But yeah, thank you very much for watching the video, and God bless.